year of the forum this year. This year's theme revolves around the role of architects in the evolving context of web of interdependencies. It triggers questions of how there is a necessity to reassess architecture and how it is practiced. The shortlisted projects identify a set of design approaches that represent a diversity in their role and stances as an architect, schools of thought, modes of representations, and act as a catalyst for multifaceted and enriching discussions. Before we start, it's very important to be cognizant of the fact that the forum is being held online for the second time due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is on all of us to acknowledge and be perceptive of the changes and challenges we have all faced in the last 18 months, and are continually grateful to all the participants and students who have taken out the time to contribute to this forum. I welcome you all to our third and last curated discussions, to build or not to be built, rather how much to build. To engage with us in a discussion today are John Palmesino, Namrata Kapoor, Malini Krishnankutty. To give a brief introduction for all of our panelists, Mr. Palmesino is an architect and urbanist born in Switzerland. He has established Territorial Agency, which is an independent organization based in London that combines architecture, analysis, advocacy, and action for the integrated spatial transformation of contemporary territories. Some of the recent projects that he has been a part of include Oceans in Transformation, which connects new forms of visibility and understanding of oceans brought by science, culture, and art. We had the pleasure of understanding his work in greater depth during the D-Talk held earlier. We welcome you, Mr. Palmesino. Ms. Kapoor is a planner and researcher who has a dual degree in architecture and city planning from the University of California, Berkeley, and has worked as a consultant for various governments, think tanks, NGOs, and planning organizations. As a planner, she has worked on the Mumbai Development Plan for 2034 for the Mumbai municipality. Through our D-Talk segment, we had the opportunity to delve deeper into her planning and research on affordable housing developments. At IIHS, she is involved in teaching, and her current research looks at the effect of land price movements on the production and consumption of housing in Indian cities and its relationship to the city planning practices. We welcome you, Ms. Kapoor. Ms. Krishnankutty is an architect and planner with a wide experience in spatial planning in India. She did her PhD in Habitat Studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and graduate degrees from University of California, Berkeley. She is currently an adjunct associate professor at CUSE IIT Bombay. Over the last 2 decades, she served as a consultant on several urban planning projects, including the Draft Development Plan for Mumbai 2014 to 34, as well as the Regional Plan for Mumbai Metropolitan Region 2016 to 36. She has also worked with the Chief Minister's Task Force and helped draft the Regional Plan document RPG21 for the state of Goa. We welcome you, Ms. Krishnankutty. Our moderators for the day are Sonal, Mithal, and Nikhil Makhijani. Sonal Mithal is an architect, artist, and educator. She holds a doctoral degree from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, master's degree from SPA Delhi, and a bachelor's degree from Lucknow University. She is co-founder of research and conservation studio People for Heritage Concern and teaches at CEPT University. Her work transects architecture, landscape architecture, queer studies, history, and heritage. Her work focuses on processes and agencies of ecological survival, contingencies of identity and representation, and emergent intersectionality as central to shaping of the built environment. Nikhil Makhijani is a recent graduate student from the Faculty of Architecture, CEPT University. Joining CEPT in 2016, when the campus started evolving physically because of its growing student body, he rooted his interest in how old buildings and sites could become places for creative thinking and discourse. Currently, he's a teaching assistant at CEPT University and is working independently on some small-scale projects involving adaptive reuse. To also introduce our presenters for today, joining us from Sri Lanka, we have Ashubodha, who has received his bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Maratua in Sri Lanka in 2019. His final year project titled Wicked is an attempt to inquire into waste disposal and management, a wicked problem through an architectural intervention. Asmita Patnaik is a recent graduate from Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture, Mumbai. Through her final year project, she questions, can architecture and urban planning create inclusive and accessible spaces that foster an environment of imagination, creativity, and innovation, both at personal and an urban scale? Anushri Shetty is a recent graduate from the Academy of Architecture, Mumbai. She is an IGBC accredited professional and is passionate about sustainable and experiential architecture. Her undergraduate thesis was an inquiry into the impact of urban biodiversity with the larger workings of a city. Anushri's keen interest in circular systems further abetted her design strategies at multiple scales. In her spare time, she enjoys editing videos and reading fantasy novels. Vaishnavi Chandrakumar is a recent graduate from RV College of Architecture, currently working as an architect in Collective Project in Bangalore. Her thesis, Set in Stone, Recreating the Unintentional Monument, is an attempt at rebuilding the intangibles of a city that still celebrates the glories of its past, Hampi. The dissertation studies the idea of memory and the spirit of old bazaars of Hampi and intends to create a new architectural adaptation for the same. A huge thank you to all of you for joining us today from different parts and various time zones around the world. I now invite one of our moderators, Nikhil Makhijani, to brief us about the session.
So today's discussion is on the topic, to build or not to build. With the times we live in, climate change, sustainable conservation, changing lifestyles, adaptive reuse, and ideas of repair become relevant to the profession, while the agency of an architect to intervene in the built environment is constantly expanding. The simultaneous nature of these two aspects call for the diffusion of this dichotomy, which compels us to probe to build or not to build, or rather even how much to build, acknowledging that the built provides new conditions for the unbuilt conditions to propagate, while the unbuilt provides new expectations from the built. This panel speculates ways in which architects can rethink what building may mean. Now for the audience, how the session is going to go forward today. We'll invite each student panelist to present their project one after the other. After that, we will invite a discussion based on some themes and provocations that have emerged through student presentation projects. Each of the guest panelists will be invited to respond to the provocation, and following which others are free to join. Student panelists will also be participating in that. To abide by the time limit, we'll keep 10 minutes for each provocation. Later, we take up the next theme or provocation and so on. After the provocation-based discussions, we'll take a few questions for the panelists to respond to from the audience. Over to you, Nikhil.
Thank you, Nikhil. So without further ado, I invite our first panelist, Ashubodha, to share their presentation.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Ashubodha Gurusingha from University of Moderator, Sri Lanka. Let's start with wicked problems. What are wicked problems? They are complex, inflexible, open-ended, unpredictable group of problems, mostly proliferating, that is directly affect for the human and other living beings. Global warming, obesity, food insecurity, drug abuse, natural disasters are some of examples. Complexity of such problems may differs according to the dimensions which the problem control itself and its stakeholder involvements. Identifying such ill-defined problems in Sri Lankan context and exploring a framework to mitigate the impact caused by such problems in related to built environment was my design position. Accordingly, I was able to identify waste crisis is a space-specific wicked problem in Sri Lankan urban context due to poor management of waste disposal. There are numerous incidents that had happened during the past decades due to the waste crisis. Among them, in 2017, on April 14, Mithal trash dump in Colombo, a garbage mountain covering 9 hectares of exceeding 60 meters in height collapsed, resulting in 32 recorded deaths and 8 missing people, displacing 965 people living in the slum areas. Mithal is considered as the backyard of Colombo city, accommodating mainly warehouses, and service sector activities, resulting rapid growth of low-income working population of the city. Dump site was used to be a wetland with rich ecosystem back in 1980s. Unsafe open dumping of mixed waste collect around this area was began by local authorities during the past decades. More than 60% of building usage are residential and 20% of service and industrial fully functional with the dump is also being filled till the dump collapse. Due to the urban sprawl, decreasing of greenery and most of open spaces causing a greater impact for the upcoming development programs in terms of urban living. Yet the dump is a major barrier at the end of the day. Annual rainfall of the Mithal is higher compared to other areas where the site is get flooded due to low topography and a canal flowing close proximity, contaminating whole region with the toxic matters from the dump. This has been a cancer spreading time to time with no possible solutions. Contamination of air, underground water table are major impacts caused by this negligence. There are many potentials in terms of social cultural context with the diverse ethnicities where the current development program failed to answer the uplifting the economic standard of the community living around the dump site. I have also researched why it is more complicated in closure of the dump after its collapse. There were 3 options accordingly. Project focused to identify the primary user as the community affected by the waste slide and the unemployed men, women, and the youth. Crisis events such as collapse of the dump are a clear manifestation of a broader wicked problems of urban waste sites and many interrelated questions of social, political, environmental, economical inequalities that are play within the context. Due to a huge political and economical barrier, authorities have moved with the in-place closure option as the best sort of solution, making and paving new paths of questions in future. And these problems are yet to be answered. What is the agency of design as an architect in shaping the instruments that go beyond the creating temporary environmental fixtures to question of the urban trash management? What kind of alternative frameworks allow trash management process become a constructive component in the design thinking? These are my main concerns. Starting with an urban vision, a service center with a Colombo metro development, restoring the affected ecosystems by dump treatment, enhancing and upgrading the social and physical living condition of the people were major concerns in my urban vision. Project consists of 3 main master proposals, phase 1 and phase 2. During the phase 1 and phase 2, dump digestion and the treatment while the creating economic generator through the upcycling. In phase 3, restoration of the wetland and uplifting the living standard of the community. Phase 2 start with the 150-day 150, where the dump digestion and the treatment process during the 3 years of time. Timeline conveys the image of each component during the project program. In this phase, mixed waste collected in the dump is extracted mechanically and categorized in two separation plants and transported to the further recycling through rails. Waste is extracted by the movable building with a modular structure with a crane. Initially, separation organic waste is done by the extraction hub and left on site. Extracted waste is transported through an elevated conveyor belt platform to separation hub, and the waste is further separated into metals, glasses, paper, polythene, etc. Separated waste is transported by making compressed bales for recycling purposes by an extended railway line. Diagrams illustrates the strategies and the treatments of the dump site during the phase 1 and phase 2, and how the strategies in order to mitigate, detox the contamination of the dump using natural plants in phase 1 and phase 2 and 3. Phase 3 start after the digestion of the dump is completed. All the buildings incorporated in the dump digestion and the buildings are interconnected with the bridges. All the buildings use phase 1 and phase 2 transform their function to support the community engaged upcycling programs and connect the restored eco park. Plans and sections represent the transitional stage where the end of phase 2 and beginning of phase 1. You can see the separate each and every buildings and the functions accordingly. The diagram illustrates how the community engaged in project interventions with upcycling hubs workshops during the project program. You can see a typical section of the community upcycling hub where the community engaged in upcycling programs, the waste collected from the regional area. When talking about the materials constructed in these hubs, the waste generated around the context, around the area is constructed these buildings and the process from the dump site during the phase 2. Talking about the functional aspects, all the building is considered to be a cyclic function, transformation of the functions. Example, extraction hub turning into a museum and a theater of waste, supporting the recreational activities and in the park. Separation hub, gallery space and extension for the workshop. And carriage hub, regional separation turns into a regional separation hub conducted by the community. These are some perspectives drawn to illustrate how the upcycling workshop are happening. During the daytime, the community who engage in the upcycling workshops and you can see the intimate spaces where the children used to make it a space for their play areas in some spaces. And this is how the public and the community engage in waste transporting and delivering to those upcycling hubs. This overall look and feel of the scheme after the transitional, at the end of the transitional stage, that means at the beginning of the phase 3. You can see in the left hand corner how the overall design protocol is happening with the restoration of the dump site and how to connect those spaces related to the economic co-park. These are the products that coming out from the upcycling hubs, because these might be a treasure for the community, because I'm creating an economic generator, long-term economic generator to the community around the dump who have been affected by the waste slide and who lost their jobs. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely presentation. If anyone has any questions or clarifications, please do ask. Otherwise, we move ahead. All right. So next up, we have Asmita, and I invite her to share her screen and present her.
Hi, I'm Asmita and I'll be talking about my thesis titled Constructing Eudemonia, Generating Positive Well-Being Within the Everyday, which looks at the possibility of creating positive well-being through urban experiences. Today, modern city development and urban lifestyle provokes a state of psychological discomfort, building on to urban stress and anxiety, especially within the metros, which needs to be mitigated. Thus, through my thesis, I wish to extend the conversation to bring forth a paradigm shift in the way we look at our cities, to consciously focus on rebuilding the fabric to bring subjective well-being and eudemonia as the locus of planning and design. This exploration of experience through a spatial setting is broached at two scales, largely the urban and the human experience of the environment. Through a spatial parameter for well-being, developed by studying varied metrics and reports that facilitated an interdependency between happiness and space, the importance of creating pro-social spaces in the construction of joy came through. The possibility of improving well-being lies in creating desirable varied opportunities to savor a pause and restore a balance in the everyday routine. In this narrative of the daily encounters, the image of Mumbai remains altered. The life in the city is imagined as a series of polyrhythms and speeds. There are seemingly limitless facets of identity that shapes one's experience in the city, but a person's movement often becomes very controlled within the work-live paradigm, making it the most critical node to create a third space which encapsulates joy. For creating a eudaimonic impact, it was integral to identify a site of immense urban stress to become a pressure point to be released. From the analysis at the urban scale and the human scale, CBDs along the key transect were found to be a point of critical urban stress, making it the focus area for the study. As a response, it is analyzed as a space for release to create a larger impact on the city. This architectural imagination could be a part of the larger Happy City Scheme 2030, which focuses on the need for more inclusive open spaces in Mumbai as a generator for well-being. Lower Parel was chosen as the eventual site which, due to its sporadic nature of urban growth, made the experience of even a 10-minute walk in the precinct a stressful one, with overflooding streets contrasting its gated offices. Further, its urban model is similar to several others in the precinct, making an intervention here a potential example of how we could, through understanding environments, improve well-being in the city. As the main anchor to the paradigm, the experience of moving through the Lower Parel station was also understood, where the urban stress was heightened due to congested bottlenecks. The intent was to alleviate this experience and trigger a positive balance for the precinct and the city at large. As the pursuit of urban happiness can only be successful through a scalar effect, the architectural strategy was that of a ripple, assisted by meta-level policies. Here, as an extension to the station and the yard, the rail yards of central Mumbai were pursued under a larger imagination for the city, where it carries a possibility of a public space reconversion in one of the most critical regions of Mumbai's morphology. At the scale of the precinct, master plan strategies were created by reorganizing its mobility patterns and pause points along its most critical routes, where, as an extension of this framework, the station was explored as an everyday infrastructure that would promote welcoming environments and experiences, uniting different users to create moments of pause and interaction, almost like a big public park that becomes the transitional interface as you move towards the platform, where the program intent was to create architecture that facilitates opportunities of respite, pro-social interaction, and opportunities to linger. By designing congenial moments of pause and interaction, which allows people to take charge of their experience, the station transition was curated as the pause between the live and the work. Developed over existing circulatory systems to create varied opportunities of movements and speed, with the helical anchoring the street on one end and the yard explored as a space of slow meander on the other, the station creates three sensorial landscapes of a semi-private to a public nature, where the wilderness of the rail yard becomes an open space for the precinct with dire need of inclusive public spaces. The court of the station annex becomes a release space for commuters as well as the locals, and the forecourt, which is the most public space, acts as the interface between the street and the railway station. A network of pause points is created within them, allowing the movement possibilities to shape the architecture, with the ground opening up for the precinct as a large park, and the thoroughfare becoming the distinct edge between the street and the plaza, such that the intervention becomes a public space to give back to the city. The intent was to create a station interface as a social landscape, with the varied trails leading to the eventual station, connected through three sensorial landscapes, which curate smaller moments of joy. In this interface, speed settings and functions were integrated, based not only as for the needs of the area, but keeping the larger intent of flexibility of movement and engagement in mind. This is the ground floor plan. Each route will be explained in detail in the further slides. The sunken quick route. Since the quick to and fro from the station is imagined as a frequented commute, its width is the largest, aided by small pause functions such as a takeaway cafe or an ATM or a kiosk, where the idea of pause aids one as they charge towards the station as opportunities of joy in the haste, with the straight arrowed route being sunk to be removed from the rest of the engagements of the entire infrastructure. The route extends out to the trail, with the helical and the ticket counter becoming the marker. The second route is the ground-paced route. Unlike the direct quick route, it has a sense of meander and secondary anchors, a space for the commuters as well as for the locals in the precinct. It anchors itself not just to the station, but the transitional building, which provides commute-assisted programs such as workshop spaces, galleries, and gym for the local residents. The program within the block are shifted to the peripheries to create unhurdled movement for the transit users within this landscape. The transitional block connects the various interlacing routes, allowing multiple choices to move out of the complex, which provides spaces of pause, built as well as unbuilt in nature, anchoring the three codes. It has smaller moments of pleasure, such as how the station concourse opens up to the holding pond and a courtyard where the access to blue-green spaces creates a calming effect in the tidal wave of transit. The ground floor is imagined to be porous and light, assisted with three columns to create an ease of movement along the park to radiate through the screen, forming an urban oasis, while the upper floors, which connect to the pedestrian bridges, act as a floating block with a similar idea of meander. The third route is the elevated quick route, which connects the various footover bridges to the main block and the helical for fast movement to both the platforms while also facilitating opportunities of work which is closer and more connected to the transit, with programs consciously created to increase the efficiency and comfort of the movement. The commute trail has smaller meanders and softer moments in the daily hustle, with the footover bridge curated as an eventful elevated promenade which expands to create release while you move to and fro the platform, while also opening up to smaller open pause spaces. The project has been consciously reworked with the consideration of the surroundings and the user's psychological health, bringing us to the last route, the route of meander, which, unlike the key routes, is a route curated for leisure, as a place to de-stress in the evenings on your way home, or maybe on a lazy Sunday to rejuvenate oneself, set within the beautiful vegetation of the existing rail yard. The route is seemingly a curation of private moments in a public space, a conscious attempt to slow down and linger, where the more public programs become the station interface, and as one moves further away, the experience becomes more sensorial and guarded. The route moves along the existing placement of the trees, running alongside the disused railway tracks. The section through the cafe is a reflection of the walk in the wilderness, creating a healing environment against the urban stress. The platform also builds into the three-column structural language as a way to subliminally set itself within the lush yard. Through the project, the idea of eudemonia is explored in the idea of having opportunities developed from the parameters of well-being. The proposed infrastructure serves as a platform to reimagine everyday routines and regain the right of how one wishes to engage with the civic infrastructure in the city. It is an investment for the inhabitants to improve their well-being, health, and overall productivity in their everyday lives. The pandemic today has shown the need for integrating well-being in our cities, the impact our environment has on our daily experiences. If what we experience is a function of how we live, how do we design for human connection? How can we improve the quality of life with the way that we build? Through my project, I wish to inquire, how much should we even build? Thank you.
Thank you, Ashmita. If anyone has any questions, please do ask now. All right, we'll move ahead to Vaishnavi. I invite her to share her screen and present her work.
Yeah, is my screen visible? Okay.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Vaishnavi. Firstly, I would like to thank the forum for allowing me to present my thesis, Set in Stone, Recreating the Unintentional Monument. The project research began as a study in haptic architecture, that is, understanding architecture as more than just a visual faculty. It could be touch, smell, sound, and even memory. If we talk about human memory, it is a direct ramification of our experiences. Memories differ from one individual to the next, and these individual memories also vary from that of the collective memory of a group. The most common way in which humankind has celebrated these memories is through monuments, and architecture became the medium through which this was possible. However, these are not the only markers of time. Just one second, my screen is humming. I'm so sorry, just give me a minute. Yeah. There are other tangible and intangible places, perceptions, and ideas that unwittingly become monuments, those which were never meant to be created. And these are places that have been valued because of their identity and purpose, and these can be described as the unintentional monuments. On the banks of the Tungabhadra River sits the glorious city of ruins, Hampi, which was once the capital of the Vijayanagara Empire. So in a place with such rich history and strong architectural context, what were the unintentional monuments that were created? This project argues that the bazaars of Hampi were the unintentional monuments. If one reads the accounts of renowned travelers such as Domingo Pace, it's very evident that Hampi was more than just its majestic temples like the Virupaksha and the Vithala. The amphibious nature of the bazaars is what made them successful. They could adapt from a regular make and sell function to the occasional jatre or even accommodate periodical street music and performances. However, Hampi becoming a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the influx of tourism has not left much room for the local life to flourish. The governing agencies involved make it difficult to physically introduce anything new into such an environment. And this has directly affected the demography of the local occupations, leading to an incessant decline in the local arts and crafts. Therefore, the program proposed is one that caters to the web of complexities that have risen out of this present-day situation. An arrival center to accommodate tourism, a public square for the people of the town, and a bazaar that celebrates the new Hampi and provides for the tourists and town dwellers alike. The site chosen sits symbolically at the threshold of Hampi. To the north of the site are the remnants of the old fort wall that separates the quiet and indolent Hampi from the proposed intervention, which is trying to revive the culture and living heritage of the region. The dissertation premise is set in memory of place and time, and for this, the elements of Hampi were conceptually reinterpreted to create a coherence of non-monumentality and monumentality figuratively. And therefore, to create these associative memories, the present-day ruins and their incompleteness has been used as a symbol of connection between the intervention and its context. When you study the old villages of Hampi, we realize that the versatility of them made it possible for everyday activities of the people to exist in tandem with one another. For example, the immediacy shared between the public bazaars and the adjacent residential quarters. Similarly, with the new intervention, everything from the movement to the abstracted visual signs must bring to the visitor the same sense of oneness with the place and enable them to connect not just physically but cognitively. So the four elements that have been abstracted are the Kalyani, the colonnade, the gateway, and the primordial landscape of Hampi itself. The spaces are structured to allow for the visitor's experience to range from a formal to a more informal one. Throughout the process, the intention for the project was to maintain a parallel narrative between the modern interpretations and the spatial learnings that the old architecture of Hampi has to offer. However, a direct analogy cannot be made from the past to the present, as the people and their lifestyles are completely different. The programs such as the craft-making spaces and bazaar provide a medium to create a new character that celebrates the past. This is in conjunction with the Interpretation Center that helps establish a deeper understanding of the history. As you approach the building from the southern edge, the structure is pulled back from the road, creating a plaza. A combination of tall columns and an imposing compound wall creates a hierarchy among the different entrance points. As you walk through, the building unfolds with the characters of a street that weaves in and out, blurring the boundaries of what's inside and outside. Through this path, there are multiple pause points that have been placed in order to break the length of the street. The first one here connects the library to the cafe for passers-by. As opposed to traditionally keeping the private separate from the public, the guest houses have been interlaced along with the public street, just like the old villages. This has been done through the raised platform and solid walls with punctures that reinforce the street while also keeping a link between the two. And the library area that sits to the east of the street is a set of semi-covered spaces within a sea of columns. This was actually inspired by my travels to Hampi, where I happened to come across the temples being used by students to study, thus making the ruins of a place of refuge in an unforgiving climate like that of Hampi's. To break away from the idea of institutionalizing public buildings, the intent of the design was to bring back the cultural togetherness through people, food, and festivities. The inordinate architecture of Hampi and its seamless presence within the context adds value to the surrounding landscape. The same idea of having a quaint relationship between the built and the unbuilt became a strong driver for this design. A simple unadorned L-shaped gateway emphasizes the entry to the interpretation center. And as you enter here, the stepping language continues as you move through the archaeological exhibit spaces. The reason for using this constant stepping language through the project is to either create or reinforce memory through movement. As you further walk through the interpretation center, the idea of being inside out is again brought back, this time tying the open bazaar area to the inside through the Kalyani. The bazaar was particularly tricky to design as having a new take on an already simple typology was difficult. So the new version became a combination of the linear boulevard along the road edge and an extrapolation on levels as freestanding columns. This was an attempt at holding on to the temporality of a bazaar as an intangible aspect by creating unobtrusive architecture which enables activities. The top of the bazaar ends in a viewing deck with the remnants of the old fort wall in the foreground, from where you can see Hampi's royal center with its temples and monuments. The freestanding columns with temporary shading devices are meant to provide the least invasive form of definition to the open market spaces. The non-monumentality of the old bazaars in terms of architecture was all compensated for through the vibrance of activity. The intention for this design was to create and generate the kind of life that seems to have been lost in Hampi and give a glimpse into the culture of what used to be, but in a way that makes sense today. At the end of the day, the idea was to create a simple space that weathers beautifully with time to gain significance, which could potentially become the unintentional monument. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. Does anyone have any other questions? All right, we'll move on to Anushri. Please share your screen and present.
I'm sorry, just give me a second. Hi, my name is Anushri Shetty, and today I'll be talking about bees. Bees are industrious little creatures known for their complex societies and elaborate hive structures. But honey is arguably what they're most known for. Well, here's a lesser known fact about bees. They pollinate 1/3 of the crops we consume and are often referred to as the keystone species of an ecosystem. They are known for their direct mutual relationships with plant population. This means that the very future of all the food we consume is closely tied to the existence of this little creature. Every third bite of food we take is all thanks to a society of bees. Since the year 2003, the world has been seeing a massive decline in bee populations due to issues such as monoculture farming, pesticides, land fragmentation, colony collapse disorder, etc. A world without bees would also be a world without strawberries, chocolate, coffee, and also honey. The grass and seed that cattle and livestock depend on would also dwindle, leading to the eventual extinction of humanity. There are currently 5 species of bees common to India. Apis mellifera and the Apis cerana are the most commonly managed bee species. India began importing the Apis mellifera in 1983. Apis mellifera, also known as the European bee, can produce anywhere between 20 to 40 kg of honey per colony per year, as compared to the Apis cerana's low output of 7 to 10 kgs. However, it has its own drawbacks. It requires a lot of maintenance, carries pathogens, and is only suited to a few areas in India. A surplus of foreign bees causes a decline in indigenous populations. Hence, it's important to move beyond the honey productivist agenda and concentrate on the bee's most important function, maintaining ecological balance. Surprisingly, the answers can be found in our cities. You see, contrary to popular beliefs, bees do pretty well in cities. Cities provide the vegetative diversity required for pollinators to thrive. However, city dwellers find it hard to adapt to this change. Most bees only travel within a 5-kilometer radius. The fragmented city landscape causes pollinators and other urban biodiversity to be limited to certain parcels of land. This largely affects the ecosystem of the whole city. The National Beekeeping and Honey Mission, launched by the Indian government in 2017, focuses on building empirical data. Lack of information regarding our indigenous pollinators is the sword of Damocles and needs to be acted upon soon. However, the NBHM purely focuses on pollinators in the rural areas, a severe drawback considering the opportunities the city can provide. As linchpin pollinators, honeybees are indirectly essential to our diet, a fact most urban citizens are unaware of. In order to restore bee populations to health, we need cities to step up and lead. The architectural solution began with the question, how can I, as an architect, contribute to the conservation of urban pollinators? The Hive project is an attempt to answer these questions through 3 levels of interventions in the city of Mumbai. Due to the lack of research in India, building a Melitology Institute was pertinent to the program formulation. However, in order to make a formalized space like a research institute more approachable, the human-centric program of a vegetable market was chosen as an allied function. The vegetable market draws attention to the connection between pollinators and the produce that we buy on a daily basis. An overarching program of a botanic conservatory further establishes this connection. The 165-year-old Baikla Vegetable Market was chosen as the site due to its close proximity to the Jiramata Zoo and the Central Railway Corridor. The intersecting programs meant designing for varied user groups, right from the Melitology staff, existing sellers, buyers, to the urban biodiversity and tourists. Channelizing this interdependency was at the core of the design. Since the structure looks at building for a resilient future, adhering to the principles of circularity was a major objective. The skin, which is the external facade, the built construction system, internal services like water and waste, internal planning of spaces, and furniture were all to follow the 3 R's of a circular economy. Construction and demolition waste are major contributors to our overflowing dump yards. Hence, designing for disassembly was key to building a future-proof structure. Pre-cut and precast members were to be bought in and assembled in order to reduce on-site impact. Steel stanchions and roofing sheets from the existing market have been reused. Passive design strategies like solar and air filtration towers reduce the load on the existing HVAC system. And by integrating services like water and waste systems within the structural design, we as architects can ensure regenerative cycles are in place. The bridge acts as an ecological connector between the zoo and the railway corridor, while also adding to the experiential quality of the market. It pierces through the central hive and opens out into the pollinator garden, leading onto the biodiverse roof. A biodiverse roof consists of indigenous vegetation which aren't landscape pruned or maintained, but are left to flourish as they would in their natural habitat. The experiential quality of the internal spaces aim at easing the idea of having pollinators within the same space as visitors, gently destigmatizing these urban helpers on an everyday basis. Bee hotels were placed in the internal roofing grid, allowing the market ecology to thrive in tandem with the bees. Thus, the site level intervention was focused on reacting to the varied user groups and site constraints, while keeping urban biodiversity and resilient architecture in the forefront. For the neighborhood level intervention, the main focus was to integrate pollinators within the city fabric. However, when change needs to be systemic, it's comparatively easier when worked on by a single proprietor. Hence, I focused on public infrastructure, distinctly on flyovers. Flyovers form natural pathways through the city and already connect important landmarks. The underpass is an urban void that can be channelized to create pollinator pathways. Pollinator pathways are essentially plant corridors that connect fragmented landscapes and allow urban biodiversity to thrive throughout the city. Since a single bridge can have different types of spaces below it, the intervention was focused towards the soffit of the bridge. Planters are to be hung below the deck utilizing pulleys and counterweights to create a system that's visually appealing, easy to maintain, and ecologically sound. The pulleys disperse the weight of the planter such that a simple ratchet winch can be used to move it. However, there are times when an old bridge cannot take the weight of a new system. At such times, an independent system can be combined with the existing bridge to create space-saving pollinator corridors throughout the city. With the new metro lines coming in all over the city, the possibilities truly are endless. When it comes to the urban level impact, the megacity of Mumbai is an excellent example of loss of urban biodiversity due to human densification. As I delved into the research of urban beekeeping laws in the megacities of Vancouver, Melbourne, and New York, it became increasingly obvious that a beekeeping policy needed to be established to sustain a healthy balance between the maintained and natural beehives. Along with the policy guidelines created, the Pollen Mobile is another city-level intervention. The Pollen Mobile is a piece of mobile architecture built on a permanent chassis that expands to form a workshop space. The mobile will also have 2 gardeners who have been trained in beekeeping and will create pollinator corners in the designated locations, ranging from school playgrounds to public parks. For example, the Pollen Mobile arrives at Diamond Garden Chamber in March. It proceeds to connect with schools in its locality, like Anthony's, Gregorius, etc. Students and citizens come in on weekend awareness workshops and training sessions. At the end of 2 months, the Pollen Mobile leaves for its next location, leaving behind more aware and sensitized citizens. Thus, the Hive project channelizes architecture's unique ability to intervene at different scales, whether in the form of small mobile structures, retrofitting existing infrastructure, or building something completely new. In this era of population shifts, climate change, and unprecedented levels of urbanization, architects have an important role in responding to the complex challenges of the built environment. Only by questioning the necessity and causal effect of the project can we build something of consequence. Architects hold a leading role in how the future is envisioned and designed, but with great power comes great responsibility. The lines of social accountability and architectural morality are getting increasingly blurred. We, as the future of architecture, need to consciously ask ourselves, who are we building for, and what are the consequences of what we build? Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. If anyone has any doubts or clarifications, please do ask me now. All right, I now hand over the mic to our moderators, Nikhil and Sonal, to commence the discussion.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the student panelists. They were a set of highly seductive presentations as well as highly provocative. So just to sum up before we start the provocations, these projects, they have been able to demonstrate a possibility to think architecture that can combine infrastructure, materiality, human as well as non-human agents. They have responded. I mean, there is this thing about architects going around identifying problems to which they can give a solution. And there is that sense that we see through those projects. So, but in the problem, in the identification of a problem, what these projects are doing is that they're identifying a disturbance. Maybe it's a calamity, for example, in the Wicked project, or a loss, a lament, a loss of memory, nostalgia, a loss in terms of, health for lives, health in terms of eudemonia, and so on. So basically, not just a problem, but a disruption that these projects are identifying. And they're also invoking the incapacity or the insufficiency of anthropocentric propositions that architectural discourse has for a long time been operating on. So that insufficiency is also coming through that project. There is in these projects a little back and forth between the urgency to build, or the need to build, versus do the projects really demand that? And that is the point at which we would have a discussion on. To begin with, we will start with Wicked, Wicked, right? Ashubodha. And I would invite Namrata and Malini for this provocation. So this project, in the way I read it, it prompts us into thinking a new kind of an architectural typology, which arises from thinking materiality, which is materiality of the waste. So dump yards, landfill sites, ruinous places are becoming settings for a potential, what Donna Haraway calls cyborgian coalition in the making. You saw, as Ashubodha showed, that the dump site itself displaced the people because of the way its materiality had that thing. So there is an agency that is there in that materiality. So the question that arises is infrastructural architecture coercing a radical change in the profession? As in, do you think we do not have a choice but to turn to design infrastructure and not avoid it, as the profession has been doing for a long time? That is the question, and I would invite Namrata to think, to present her thoughts, and then we can move on.
No, absolutely. I mean, I feel like infrastructure infrastructure becomes like that one place where people find it necessary. Like, this is, okay, a couple of thoughts come to my mind, actually. One is that infrastructure usually ends up being funded through public money, So there's that aspect of it where there is a public sort of claim to what gets built. And usually infrastructure has been built in this manner where, in India, there's this idea of like PWD hai, PWD ka, kaam hai, like that kind of a thing. And increasingly people are demanding, and you can see it through all of these projects as well, that you want something more out of that infrastructure. Whether this is through a couple of like sample examples that come to us, whether it's through the exploration of form, or whether it's through the exploration of what else could this provide. There is also this idea of subversion, like what else. So, for example, when I was in Berkeley that time, there was a studio that was done to explore like what is the architecture of the border wall between US and Mexico, and most of the projects were very subversive. They were not, so it's a kind of a critique as well. And like I was saying, like, because it is that public money which is going into it, there is a certain kind of claim, right? Like that you can stake, and you have a lot more leeway actually with infrastructure than you probably have with the design of a house, actually. Like, where you just have you can't say that I demand as the public for this to be in this manner, right? So I feel like it is it's a very potent space to actually go ahead and do interesting architecture. So yeah, definitely.
Sorry, so Nikhil, you want to come in?
Yes, so what we do realize is that the architects need to be more aware of things that they are usually not aware of. So that brings in how garbage is being used. So considering Ashubodha's project, garbage, landscape, topography. And in this, I would like to bring in Malini, that, at what process, at what stage the architect should now, what we realize is that they need to bring in other professionals also into the process of design. So how do you see that other professionals can help in this design process?
Okay, so, typically, firstly, it was very interesting, as a planner, it's one doesn't walk into design studios very often these days. So it was kind of interesting and a kind of a breath of fresh air in one way to see infrastructure and these ideas about the city. So to answer your question, at what stage can the architect come in to these kinds of projects? I think, at the cities already, what we have is that most infrastructure projects are conceived as projects, right? So they become, they are automatically projects where architects can intervene. But if your question is, how can architects come in and rethink the standard processes? How can they become, in a sense, catalysts for change? How can they go in with these different ideas and have city administrators kind of modify or change the way they're doing things? I would say that that too, in a sense, is easier today because of the huge, the nature of how we have changed the way we are doing projects. Take the Mumbai development plan, for instance. We are hiring consultants at, so there is, probably this is the right time. You can meet, I know people who actively have created projects out of nothing, right? By maybe holding an exhibition, getting their councillors interested, getting the municipal commissioner involved, kind of reaching out to public officials. And there is, I think, a hunger also for this kind of new thinking. So today, I think there is a lot more, it's a much more porous, there is a space for this kind of involvement. But what struck me when I saw the Wicked project is the question of, do we need to think at a different scale? And, the idea that, in fact, it kind of goes across all projects, that how do we then, when we are worried about how much to build, is it that you need, is decentralization, is there a need to rethink the scale at which we are going to intervene? Is there a need to think of ways, like here you create this dump site, which you transform this dump site into a park, and that's not a new idea, because you take the Delhi master plan, that's what it was conceived as. The landfill will automatically become a park 20 years later. It was built into the vision, right? So I don't think that is interesting by itself, but the question is then what is the future of this infrastructure? It's not here. I think the vision was that this will continue and you will find new ways of recycling and that there'll be an upscaling, and we'll definitely have waste. So is there a different scale of intervention, which is then kind of decentralized and transformed, and this is something that I think in all the projects, when you ask the question of what happens at the meta, at the big scale, and then how do you, if you're asking the question, how much to intervene, how to intervene, is it a question of scale? At what point does a city or a settlement start having bad effects? So what is that question, or what is that neighborhood scale, or what is the right scale, at which you can stop or reduce the impact?
Yes, thank you, Malini. And I think your concern about the scale, how does it start proliferating in different scales across neighborhood cities, regions, and so on. It again loops back to the initial thought that, is this something that has to become more it has to pervade the profession. It has to become the thing, and the profession needs to change from its elitist stand to start looking that this is where maybe we need to pay attention, and so on. So it is definitely a direction in the way the profession is being coerced to change itself. So I would invite now Ashubodha to respond to any of these comments that have been made by Namrata and Malini. And and just like, how do you see yourself or this project being taken forward?
First of all, I would like to thank for the those who have commented on my presentation. And I would like to say about the scale of the project, because when my during my research, I was able to find out that there's a huge problem in in terms of economic level in Sri Lanka, because most of the authorities in our country have they are very not willing to spend much money on these types of issues in Sri Lankan context. So that's why these types of accidents happen due to the mismanagement of the waste in urban context. So and the another fact that I would like to say regarding the Colombo, or the waste generated from the around the Colombo area is not much effect for the conversion of energy preparation of energy. So that means we can in some countries the waste is transformed into energy that the people can use out of them. So but in here it is very difficult to make a program like to intervene in such scenario. That's why I was thought to think it in a smaller scale, how the community can engage in upcycling processes and giving them the opportunity in to make an long-term economic generator, because the waste is always we can generate at time to time. There's no end in waste generation. So that's why I want to interpret my project with the how to make more solutions in terms of solutions for the social issues, and as well as the environmental issues that may cause in future times. So and under the theme, what I would like to say, the cyclic function of each buildings, because I in my project I want I do not want to demolish those buildings at the end of the project. So I convert those functions into communal programs that will support for the further their economic activities happening.
Yeah, so thank you, Ashubodha. So I'll bring in John in now. So is architecture now going in a direction that it now prioritizes infrastructural needs of the society and is no longer concerned with the luxuries of the rich? Like, would you like to add something to that?
when we think of infrastructure, of course, what comes to mind is the movement of people, the substrata attached to provisions. And I would like to add a different remark rather than thinking roads and pipes and internet connections and waste management. I would like to add an element of infrastructure, which is what we call the infrastructural unconscious, or the what some friends would call the spectral infrastructure. Infrastructure is nothing else than the complex transformation of an ambition into a protocol, and that is a structure that of society that basically comes with transforming planning into policy. Or to say it more clearly, it makes you dependent on structures of provision rather than them allowing you to flourish. So we come, it's not what sustains us, it's what we depend on. I think this is an important transformation that we're seeing in the contemporary life. And so the projects that we saw today, yes, they are maybe a transition from, say, a different class system, from what you call the rich to the poor. But I actually think that what is beyond that is that the real difference is who is planning. And it seems to me that the movement from planning to policy is really a way in which there's a sort of prevarication or reintroduction of new forms of command, or better say, an infrastructural unconscious that appears through the protocols of contemporary life. And so the different projects that we saw today were really interesting because they were in a ghostly way, because they were never really present or explicitly made so. The different polities, the different groups of people that will organize these plans seem to me to be thought from bottom up. And I thought that that was an interesting condition. I wonder why they were so somehow between the lines, they're addressed like this, because it seemed that these are problems that are really complex. But what I really appreciated of all the projects was that there was a sort of occupation of the ideas of infrastructure within completely different terms. So it was an idea that architecture can sit in thinking the very complex markets of waste, or could sit in thinking the reorganization of heritage sites, or could sit in complex projects to revitalize some part of ecosystems. And I think that is the interesting element, that there is what used to be thought as architecture as having to respond to a built demand. I think that what was really interesting here was that the thinking of infrastructure from an architectural point of view was taking into consideration new forms of aggregation and association. So I thought this was something interesting, and it reminds me really that infrastructure in the end is just a set of protocols.
Yes, so Namrata wants to add to this.
No, I can ask the question at the end. I just want to add one point over here. Both Mali and I worked on the Bombay Master Plan and the draft one. And we worked with a very senior planner who, once made this observation that it is actually, the master plans are not getting implemented, but it is actually the projects which have project champions that are getting implemented. And I just want to bring that point back in here, because infrastructure actually might have a lot more impact and actually get implemented in a context like India as compared to things like master plans, which are like much longer term planning and stuff like that. And this is not a thing that, you want to take lightly for that aspect, like in the sense that debates around infrastructures are actually very potent debates. And I completely agree with John. It was really delightful to see it actually being thought from the ground up, as well as, the very nature of infrastructure is that it is top down as well. So there is that shifting of scales which was happening in this in the projects for sure. Yeah, I'll ask the question last. Yeah.
Yeah. So taking the discourse further that we have initiated now, I would like to bring in Asmita's project, as it provides us with a unique approach. Today, if such a project is to be done in reality, we know that the architect who will design the project would be someone who might not even use this facility, but the architect holds the privilege when he's designing to make these presumed statements on how people behave, what they like, and this is what I feel is a very this idea of that the architects can tend to impose the way one should live out of their own experiences, which is quite oppressive as an idea, and that too at a scale, at an infrastructure level. The the problem then enhances. So this is where they tend to think that they don't think about the main activity, and they bring in activities that might be used by a selected few. So now I would like to bring in the question that does architecture need to go away from its obsession with providing these different functions? And if what we, and I'll add what Asmita's question is, that is what we experience, if what we experience is the function, and how do we design for human connections? I would like to ask like John to take this further.
We're dealing here with a very ambitious setup, an idea that we can think of spaces through a different ethics. I think this is a really incredible task that a student sets up for herself, and I think you've done a really great job. It's a really impressive idea to think of happiness, the pursuit of happiness, as the ethical rationale around the organization of an infrastructural node. Now, here, I come from a very different background, of course, but I could bring two elements to the table in thinking this relationship between the ambitions and the realization. Let's put it like this. If in Europe, we would see a big infrastructural node like the one that you are designing, what the large bunch of the budget will be for security. Security is so expensive, and attached to security, there will have to be a lot of commercial spaces in order to pay for that security. But security is an interesting spatial device. It's an interesting piece of architecture because it has really transformed from containment and separation into a reorganization of flows and proximities, which then bring the entire organization of architecture to manage basically crowd movement and to think crowds in complex spaces through complex modeling. That's why it's so expensive to do, really difficult to model crowd behaviors, and of course through the other kind of infrastructure that is surveillance infrastructure and monitoring, in particular, adjuvated by artificial intelligence. And what you start seeing is a very interesting realm in which the idea of imposing ways of life and, or let's say, of organizing flows, of organizing behaviors starts being connected to biomimicry. In particular, starts being connected to the study of swarms, starts being connected to the movement of animals, in birds in particular, that are modeled, and that then that modeling appears actually in the same software that planners use, and the entire organization in complex realms starts being really an interesting migration of concepts. We start from an ethology, understanding of movement of animals, and we move into infrastructural projects. And I think that the idea of happiness in all of that and the pursuit of a different means rather than the calculation of the general good is initially a very interesting setup. But my question would be whether, if we have a functionalist approach, the major function is basically the possible calculation of the general good. Or there might be debates. There can be public and ethical debate about whether it's possible to introduce a new technology, a new form of the city. But it seems to me that the current way in which we migrate concepts across softwares and across modelings and across disciplines, from biology to social life, from social life to architecture, is leaving behind a sort of an empty space that is unquestioned. And that empty space is really one where I wonder whether the ethics of happiness could be really so pursued, and what is the forum in which those projects can be debated and articulated and established as a collective. So I really think that this is an extremely interesting and provocative project. But the question for me is really how to imagine architecture then as the construction of that forum, and the construction of say, in previous decades, we would have called it the civic or the Republican space. How do we imagine the construction of what we would call a polity in relationship to these questions of architecture? So this is when I think the project is really extremely provocative, and more than provocative, it's intimating. It's an intimation to reorganize the way we think of how we are together. And I think this was really an initial note. And I think the question is really, how do you get together? How do we assemble? How do we reassemble through architecture?
Thank you, John. I just want to build up on that and your thought about how do we assemble and how do people assemble this project, start reimagining reassemblies and self-organizations. You did invoke this idea of crowd management, control of movement. And so that reminds me of rhythm analysis, something that Lefebvre published, I mean, his wife published after he died, which kind of recognizes the break in the rhythm, the arrhythmia. When the rhythm breaks, like that is how the body functions, like our organic body functions. When the rhythm breaks, that is when we realize that we are sick. And so the breaking of the rhythm has a lot of agency. It has a lot of potential in designing. So there is this crowd management. There are people that are controlling the movement. And then there is this project that is situated there, which lets people pause. So there is a break. You know, all of that is happening. So what this project is trying to do, that's how I'm seeing it, is trying to, you know, address that control, that thing that, you know, you have to constantly be catching the trains and so on and so forth, is breaking that. And so the question that arises is that how much is the project again getting into the frame that it tends to control the break of the rhythm as well? Or can some things be just be like, you know, so what are the mechanisms in which some things can just self-organize? Like the way, you know, emergence has been written about, like how ants self-organize and things like how SimCity has been designed and so on. So I would invite Malini here to say, like, do we, how much again do we build for, like, you know, this break in the control or break from the stress, or, you know, this control this urban life has posed on us? Is such an approach also elitist, or to say that, you know, this is the only way happiness functions? This notion of happiness, is it like a very uniform in this thing? And I mean, can we just loiter in the forest which was created in the urban area under the bridge, and we don't need so much of navigation. I don't know, like Malini, your thoughts on this?
So, when I saw this project, the Happiness Project, of course, there were many thoughts, which, like, firstly, like I said, just this release of being able to completely, not worry that that's central government land, not worry that this will never, in the sense that you're able as a student to imagine beyond these typical issues that as planners we look at something and don't see the potential because it is locked away due to some ownership or the other. So it's great to be able to free yourself and look beyond these things. What struck me was that in the government, like if you look at public space in India, you don't see, there are hardly any projects that are taken up, through planning interventions. The spaces are there, but there are no, you don't see those interventions because you don't have those projects they're not available in some ways for architects, they're not conceived as projects, the public space projects. And there are a few exceptions to that. But if you look at Mumbai and you say you want to rethink these public spaces, it's hard to to take over public spaces and provide them, right? I mean, there is that issue. But having said that, I would say that, how does one then conceive of a project that goes beyond, that goes across classes? What does pause and happiness mean then for across society? And is it just allowing access, the first step? I mean, in our public spaces in Mumbai, we see the exact opposite: greater and greater control and closure. What were open gardens are now restricted hours. And of course, during the COVID, pandemic, it's even worse. But so just, and then the sea, the water's edge, the beach is again a commons for the fisher folk. So when the city takes that over, you're actually into another space. So there are also conflicting claims. So it becomes, it's I think as a project, it's an interesting project to talk about pause in this really busy city, and to think about larger public spaces and the need for that kind of green. Yet, even though there's a declining biodiversity in Mumbai due to these mega projects that are relentlessly being pursued, especially transport infrastructure, yet till very recently, especially in colonial times, you had every road being planned along with trees. So the road was never just a road, which you see today. It's a road without a planting plan that follows through with it. So I would be curious to see, if you look at Lower Parel, were the trees mapped before and through the project? I mean, that's an interesting a different kind of space. I remember some parts of Dadar and, those areas, you have these tree-lined streets with themselves are a release as you just walk into or get into them, because of the canopy of the rain trees and so on. So I feel that Mumbai actually, while it is so, it is transforming rapidly, but there are, especially in the island city, you have these wonderful spaces which exist. And I don't know, I think it's about access. To me, frankly, it's not the fact that if you can just open up a space and make it available and say, you're welcome, and without the security guard and without the fence, that would be the starting point for sure. Yeah.
Namrata, would you like to add to this?
No, I was just thinking about what John said and Malini said, and I completely agree with John on because Mumbai has been attacked by a lot of, like, there have been a series of bomb blasts. There have been there was a 26/11. Like somehow the ripples of like the terrorist attacks have continued. Have been oppressing like way after, like the way in which the gateway of India, site has been completely cordoned off, and with these metal detectors that you have to cross through, it's completely like ruined the kind of public space that it used to be in some ways, right? Anyway, so I completely agree on that. I was thinking about what Malini you were saying, and I completely agree with you on that. Like that freedom that. Like as a student you can have for not thinking about what the land ownership patterns are, like and that was completely what struck me when when I was seeing her project, because I remember we as students had designed the millland areas around these railway stations at one point in time, and one of our sites was Elphinstone Road station, and the Elphinstone Road mill next to it, and the whole idea at that point in time was like, oh, there will be this big plaza that connects, one side of the railway station to the other side of the other side of the road. And what it actually ended up being was one narrow gully was left between the station and the next road, and it's a horrible space, like with concrete, which is like rising on both sides, and there is this tiny narrow walking lane that takes you from the station area to the road. And it was just horrible to think about how that had been done. And I remember a friend of mine was in one of the conferences, and she pointed to, what is this public infrastructure that was provided? And the person who was in charge of the design of that, mill said, you should be thankful we are even giving you this access. And, immediately my friend was like, that means that we require more state control to take over your lands then, like that. There was this kind of like back and forth, and that was happening, very heated debate. But I was thinking also about the idea of like opportunity, like what is the opportunity of this kind of integration? And I was thinking about concepts like the new concepts in planning, like for example, multimodal integration, that brings together like various departments, and forces them to work together. And what would it mean to also get a parks and planning department into the idea of the multimodal integration? Just like what would they do if they were also a part of that? Very big proponent of like being opportunist and like finding these places where you just push a little bit more, and so I feel like that was one thing. And one last thing I want to say is this. I was wondering also if your project is not about the project, but more about a mindset, that there is this idea of pleasure, which is important. Because, some cities just can do it, right? Like, for example, New York can say, yes, we can convert an old, railway line into a high line because we are those people, and Bombay can't do it. Why? Because we can't. Like, we are the struggling people with a spirit of survival kind of. I mean, this is the kind of, what is the identity of the city that pushes for a certain kind of pleasurable project to take place? Like, and how do you push for that identity over like we are the survivors, all the time, who drown in every monsoon? I'm sorry, it's very personal. But yeah, that's the kind of question that this project as a mindset would ask, I feel.
Okay. Thank you, Namrata. Asmita, so the question is to you. There are 2 points that emerged. One was access, like giving access is enough. The other is about, can the third world, this whole idea about leisure, is that a privilege that third world country is denied, or it, I mean, how do we have to be apologetic about that? Or is there, even the idea of leisure itself, can that be different? And this idea of crowd control versus, your breaking and situating, kind of resisting that crowd control, that project start. Any thoughts that you have as you would respond onto it. And like you can also like think of it as an opportunity that your project may also evolve into something else based on these comments that you've received.
Thank you so much for the platform. I would like to say they're really interesting perspectives, and it really opened my eyes as to my own project in a way, because there were these lenses and these perspectives that I had not really integrated while working my project, but they were still somewhere there at the back of my mind. To start with, I would like to respond to Namrata about how, yes, my project was like it was about changing a shift in the way that we look at our cities and the way that we look at our infrastructure. I believe that for a very long time, we have kept the idea of well-being and the idea of happiness as this idea that once your base needs have been are fulfilled, it's only then would you want something more. But if you would actually see, there are already these smaller impulses in the city. In fact, as a part of my research, I did a study about the joy in Mumbai, where I looked at what is the possibility of an inclusive space like Marine Drive or Oval Maidan, and why do these places be successful? What is the reason? And how, even as people struggle with floods, as people struggle with their daily life incidents and everything, that these opportunities of spaces of pause that do improve their lives. And when I talk about this idea of well-being, or when I want to this idea of well-being to be discussed at level of the city or the country, it's important to bring that question in. In fact, even the fact that we do not look at happiness as a base need reflects in our happiness ranking. Today, we are one of the poorest in terms of happiness, in terms of life satisfaction. And I do believe that our environments and the way we approach our cities has a very strong impact as to why it is that way. Because for a lot of cities, like you said, for New York, it is, yeah, we care about it, so it's going to happen. But for us in Bombay, it's like, okay, we're survivors, which is great. But what is the platform to be more than the survivors? What is the platform for our well-being? What is the platform for our open spaces? And to answer John Palmesino's question about crowd control, very interestingly, I didn't realize that my project was inherently becoming about crowd control. What I was trying to do is sort of provide a choice, because what I really believe that an infrastructure in Bombay lacks is the opportunity of choosing how you want to travel. That is not to say that you have these 4 systemic different methods and you choose either or, but like you have a choice of what more could you want from infrastructure, what more could you want of your daily experiences, and what do you choose to interact with. For all I know, someone might just ignore the entire infrastructure and just go to the platform. For all I know, someone might choose to just linger around completely and not even interact with the station. But through my project, the kind of conversation I was trying to start is, when do we start looking at further opportunities, not as a way to crowd control, but as a way of providing for well-being, in a way of letting people have some control over how and what and when they want to experience. That means they can choose what kind of programs they want to engage with, what kind of speech settings they want to be a part of. Maybe they choose to just go at random. Maybe they go through the plaza and then they end up going to the rail yard, and that could be the way they want to move, and that's perfectly fine. But there should be an opportunity of doing that. Also, further to add to Malini's question about land ownership and how land ownership is such an integral part, and that's the reason practically a lot of things do not work out this way. That is a very interesting question. And also the comment that you made about how the inner city or the fort area is so beautifully planned, and how that does have a very positive impact. Like if you ask someone to travel to CST, they would happily walk for hours. But if you ask someone to even spend 5 minutes in Lower Parel, they would go mad. And there's a reason for that. Our environment does directly impact how we feel. And that is why we should really think about what changes we can do in the environment to create it. Like you mentioned, how we need to care about the kind of trees that are getting built, and how the idea of well-being can be as small as providing shade. But my project is just an open discussion about the multiple opportunities, and through these opportunities, what could be the possibilities of well-being, which may not stick to one class or one kind of an idea, but as a more of an inclusive and open space. And this is your precinct, this is your park, this is not a station, it's your park, and you choose how you wish to work through it, you choose how you wish to move through it. And even for me, the question of land ownership was
extremely questionable initially. I remember trying to contact Railway Land Development Authority, whose land it belongs to, and actually understanding the multiple agencies that work in a city. In fact, when you were talking about Ashubodha's project, I had a similar question about, we talk about how multi-scale is a very important way to go, but in practice, how do we actually engage in a multi-scale approach, and which agency sort of takes charge of a multi-scale approach? And in that, when a land belongs to the public, who really has the ownership over it and who really has an agency over it? Or is that land a negotiation for multiple agencies to sort of come together where, as per, at least since my project was theoretical in nature, I imagined the land to be in an agency between the RLDA and the Happiness Department of BMC, where I believe that both would wish to come together for a greater cause. It may not really happen, but that is the approach where they want to really improve the quality of life in Bombay. And to give profitable measures to the RLDA, there are opportunities of cafes, co-working spaces, and other monetary programs which are inserted with the inclusive open space programs as a way for them to even have some profit on their end, and for the BMC's plan of Happy City 2030 to even still be successful. So I hope that helps to the discussion to some extent.
Thank you, Asmita. Would anyone like to respond to this, or we shall move forward to Vaishnavi's project? Okay, so moving forward, Vaishnavi's project Set in Stone, Recreating the Unintentional Monument, poses an argument that we need to move forward to introduce elements that could become vessels for progress in a city like Hampi, which is known to be a city of ruins. So her process wants to actually design a prosthetic, like a prosthetic arm for a human, that like a prosthetic arm for Hampi that provides for what is missing and fulfills its need and doesn't ruin what it is still known for. So this is where now her attempt to associate the new with the memory makes me wonder that what kind of prosthetic a memory would need, because memory is lost, and when it is recreated, it is made permanent. So now the question comes in that when does the prosthetic starts competing with the ruin, and do we as architects go overboard in designing the prosthetic? Namrata, if you would like to start the conversation.
Actually, I have a strange relationship with conservation heritage projects, because I've always felt like that. There's actually a very nice paper by Arjun Appadurai that talks about conservation, where he speaks about if conservation was taken out of and I'll tell you why I'm talking about conservation in a minute. If conservation was taken out of, this obsession with the building and more about preserving the multiple imaginations about what could have been built on that site, it's a very different, then it enters the realm of exhibitions and museums, that's where you're sort of displaying that there was not one imagination, but there were many imaginations that actually existed over here. And that kind of sums up my relationship with the idea of heritage, right? Like in the sense that there's not, heritage is not the most pedestal thing. There are new things which are coming out, which might have their own value systems, own possibilities, and that even that what remains, actually there were many things below it, and also many other things that didn't get built when on this spot that we are trying to preserve or call heritage in that sense. So as an homage to the structure that you're building, I do not think that people go overboard with prosthetics, but the question for me is, how do we remind people that that was not the only thing that exists over here? Here, this is a spot for your viewing pleasure. This is, UNESCO sites had this placard saying, for the enjoyment of all humanity. Like, this is the space where you are going to enjoy this heritage of our country, etc. But this is not the only imagination. That many other imaginations also existed in this spot. And addition of architecture to that space is a part of that process. Does that make sense? I'm trying to articulate it as best.
Yeah, it does. And I just want to build up on that. And so, you are invoking a lot of questions. One is heritage. And heritage, so the project, Vaishnavi's project, it does invoke this idea of memory, which is like somebody's memory, right? Like whose memory? And which also then invokes this classic question of whose heritage. So, and that is where Namrata is coming from. Like, it invokes a lot of imaginations and a lot of, stakes that are there. So we're not very sure where that project is situated. But I want to come back to this question of nostalgia and memory that Vaishnavi has raised in her project. And I do believe that nostalgia, by its very essence, by how we experience nostalgia, we experience it because we experience a sense of loss. We don't have it anymore. That is a precondition to experience nostalgia. Now, the project, it claims that it's invoking nostalgia, or it's like trying to, bring back, situated itself in a response to nostalgia memory. But if you rebuild, if you build so much, like, again, bringing it to the theme of how much do we build? If we bring too much, have we not lost the loss? So where the nostalgia is never going to come because the loss is not there anymore. So you have fulfilled the loss, and in that fulfillment of the loss, the nostalgia is gone. So those are my thoughts. But I would again invite the panelists here to first Malini and then John. Just build up on these thoughts or something that you would want to add from your own position vis-a-vis the project and what it wanted to do.
So, I would come from the position of a planner and, how typically the, planning doesn't really think of heritage at all, except for kind of leaving that buffer space and leaving the monument. That's been the traditional response. And for me, the Hampi epitomizes and actually has some of the best kind of local involvement and certain efforts that have gone, where people have tried to come up with these integrated kind of conservation plans with people, in the involvement of the local people. So I think in the Indian context, we have such amazing places, and so few are demarcated, are even recognized as heritage. So every time you go to an older core of any city in the country, you're going to come up with these fabulous, wonderfully old, wonderful spaces that we have. And yet, as planners, we do not have any response. You need the conservation architect to come and first list it. And I think this is the gap, because the profession has no response, because we've not been taught that, right? So I think the issue really is, how do you plan at all in such a context? And when it is so ubiquitous, actually it's everywhere. In every city that you visit, there is this continuity. And I think when you recognize that and you respond to that, then it becomes necessary that you recognize what is the local impulse, what is it that people want, and then I think you would be able to come up with a way along with the people of how to take care or take this precious object that means something much more, and there's so much more that it's a recognized national monument. I think there needs to be a real dialogue, and so I would say that what you insert, what you don't insert as an architectural piece there is for me less, in more and more in the practice of planning everywhere. You think that our issue really is that we're not talking enough to understand what people want, and we are so worried about the image, or we are so worried about some other iconic kind of view of what this place should be. So I think we have so much that we are losing every day in terms of heritage, that we really need a response as a profession, as a to how do we look at what is part of our history. How do we safeguard? What do we safeguard? What do we take away? And what is it? It's okay to let go. How do we actually continue? And like Namrata said, how much, what is that? And 100 years later, what happens then? So it's a little difficult to say that you can just leave that area out completely. And we don't know what, unless we talk to the people and understand that maybe it's, right now it's only a tourist impulse, right? Which is allowed to flower. So I would say that we need to really rethink our insertions in any of these historic contexts. And this brings me to all those other places which are not even recognized, or not even, we are building all over and around them. And this is the most, one of the most acclaimed sites we have. So yes, we tend to treat it as a little jewel, but I think even there we need a lot more involvement with people. And maybe a bustling market right there is okay, it's perfectly okay, and we have to decide how much we want that, or how we want to insert that. Thank you.
Thank you, Malini. John, your thoughts on the project?
And of course, monuments are what made architecture in the Holocene. Monuments are really how humans have conceptualized their relationship to materialities in the 11,000 years of climate stability. In the Anthropocene, monuments are really something that can only be addressed in the terms that you are addressing, in loss. I would like to move from loss to threat, because it seems to me that loss brings with the monument the ideas that you also mentioned of the past and memory. Well, I am really convinced, on the contrary, that the entire notions of conservation is a way of addressing futures, not pasts, through a very clear demarcation of what a threat is. Now, you are setting up structures to preempt a loss, to preempt a complete destruction. So I think that the way in which I see it is that the contemporary practices on conservation, in particular the ones around monuments, and the entire discussions between material and immaterial heritage, particularly the one initiated by UNESCO, and with many excellent successful examples, but also with many controversial structures, which are inherent with a very complicated mechanism of that institution. It seems to me based on a sort of prevailing Eurocentrism. And the prevailing Eurocentrism of conservation as one underpinning element, which is exactly the distinction between materiality and immateriality. As if there will be a material structure that can be detached from the immaterial heritage, or better, you can ghost monuments, in the sense that you can have images without bodies. And I think ghosting could be a way in which you can approach your project or similar projects in order to understand them more clearly in relationship with the complex mechanisms of the production of forgetting that we are seeing today in the construction of contemporary built environments and the administration of forgetting. So it seems to me that if you take an analysis that is looking at future and the threats of loss in that sense, the administration of forgetting seems an interesting way in which you could articulate the contemporary debates around preservation. In particular, the fact that, and I go back to it, the Eurocentrism. It seems to me that the universalisms that are attached to the idea of preservation, which I indicated, are relying very much on the distinction between the world of ideas and the notion of culture and civilization and the materiality, is missing completely the point of the epoch we are living in, where that distinction is no longer possible, where that distinction between our practices, our ideas, and the material basis is no longer so clear-cut. So I think that, for instance, the fact that we obviously live in an epoch where we don't agree on anything, we have only clashes. We only have clashes between multiple users, could be a way in which the preservation projects could somehow start negotiating in a very interesting way through architecture. And I think you've indicated the interesting paths where architecture can do that. I mean, we can discuss the architectural language, we can discuss the entire notion of composition and the materiality of your project, but it seems that you're bringing forward an idea that the project of conservation cannot be thought only within the terms of the material and immaterial division. And there was a moment in the project where I think it was that came about very clearly, that there was an ambition to have some of the spaces that you were designing as spaces where people would sit and study or learn from each other. It was not clear, a portico or a colonnade. And in ghosting, I think that would be a very interesting situation. If you think that space is a ghosting situation where administration of forgetting happens, what kind of study would that be? Is it a study in a university, in the protocols of different faculties? Is it a study in prescribed notions of proficiency? And would it be a study that is only for those who are enrolled in or would it be a study for the multiple polities and the multiple groups that could inhabit that space? And that seems to me a very interesting provocation in your project, because I'm reminded, of course, that the entire notion of preservation is stemming out of the League of Nations. The entire notion of preservation and the forefather, so to say, or foremother of UNESCO was an idea carried out by Bergson at the League of Nations, whereby preservation would be a way in which diplomacy, public diplomacy, becomes a continuous engagement of everyone with everybody else. But in your project, there's a sort of a flip, not that we will all agree because we have to preserve, but we will all disagree because we have to learn. And I think that is an interesting way of reading your project. And I'm happy that I've been seeing your project, and we had an initial discussion earlier about the role of archaeology, and I think it's a beautiful project, and I wanted to compliment you as well as everybody else of the students for the incredible clarity and pungent presentations.
Thank you, John. And although we're running out of time, but I'm really tempted to respond to what you just said. It speaks to me a great deal in this, this idea of forgetting, which removes the burden of remembering, and in remembering the preserving. It is also like somehow in my mind, it ties up to the next project. which is like wanting to situate itself in a post-anthropocentric or questioning the anthropocentric agenda of serving the humanity, serving human needs and comforts and things like that. And in that preserving something which is the monument which establishes the permanence of human endeavor is something which is also very human centric, and forgetting then becomes that attitude which releases us from that burden. And that is quite it can be quite liberating in that sense. So before we move on, it would be apt to move on to the next project with this thought, but I would like to invite very quickly Vaishnavi, if you want to respond to this thing. And I may have to request you to be really, really precise because we are running out of time. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for all your comments. And I agree, because I think through the project itself, the biggest question was, I am talking about, introducing these markers of memory, which people can relate to. But I think what we often miss out on, especially when it comes to design, is we imagine our buildings to be a certain way. We think that people will relate to it in that way. And we're trying to do that by introducing elements in our design. But how much do people actually, correlate with us on that aspect? Like I'm saying, I want to, reinforce nostalgia and, through these markers and, movement and everything. But it's a difficult question, like Malini was saying, in terms of heritage, how much to build and, integrating with the local people. It's a preservation and heritage. It's really hard to design for, because it's more than us just inserting a building into an environment. It's also about how people think. And for example, if you look at any of the ASI buildings in, like, even if you look at like Adalat, you have this park which denotes, which has like a green lawn. And it's a very prominent way to like describe how an ASI site should look. So in a place like Hampi, where everything is they're trying to retain the original structure the way it was, and by doing that, they're protecting it so aggressively that introducing anything physically becomes really difficult. So that was the biggest challenge with this project, because firstly, how do you make people associate well with your building, and also where is that line that you draw and sort of negotiate with the authority, saying my project is not going to ruin the beauty of the place as it is. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. We'll move on to the last section. Just one housekeeping note. Akshar or any of the conveners, how much time do we have for the question and answer? And do we have time? Like we're already like 3 minutes for the session to end. So what I would suggest is that if the participants or the audience can type in their questions, and we can take one question each, like maximum 3 questions. We'll take one question each for each of the panelists, if there are any, and we'll close the session so that you don't get delayed for the next thing. Is that all right?
Yeah. Yes, sure.
So they can type in the meanwhile, the session continues, and they can type in their questions. All right. So thank you, Vaishnavi. And we'll move to the last thing, which is the V project. So it reminds me, it is a lot about, giving the agency to the bee. And it reminds me of Donna Haraway's work, something that is very close to my scholarship as well. And so she invokes this idea of symbiosis, which is to make with, and where it's like the human agency is nothing, but it is always human or non-human or anybody, whoever is existing is always there because of its interdependency on something else. And so she says earthlings are never alone. They are always in the form of symbiosis, always working with. So my question to you, I would bring in John here, I think, and we would also like to, tap into your expertise on the subject, where what is the potential of such a project to become an opportunity for fostering or forging human, non-human correlations as an architectural practice? Where there is one way in which architects can provide a place where bees can thrive, but the other way would be that the human and the bee, in this case, they correlate together to foster something, which is like we don't have to be deterministic towards what the building would be like or the project would be like. It happens on its own. So some things that are led to be, and again the question is, or the provocation is in the context of how much do we build. So over to you, Joe.
Maybe on the dualism, human, non-humans, I would like to add the post-human, which is a category that tries to really undo the structures through which we've been thinking, always of either subsidiarity or functionality. And at the center of this attempt of expanding these agencies, I think lies a very critical condition through which we still inhabit a world where we think that the structures that are impinging on what we imagine immaculate nature are designed. Hence, they're within our agency. So if we will design them better, they will impinge less, or they will weigh less. I think this really got to do with a sort of moralism that is underlying modernism, a moralism about what it means to be good, in particular what it means to be good in public life. And I think that what you're saying, Sonal, is really important. I think it demands for architecture a radical change in ethics to operate in a multi-agency world. Let's imagine a very simple issue. I don't know the situation with the board of architects in India, but in Europe, I've done research. There's not one single board of architects that would demand, it's a profession, so it's demanded by deontology, which is an ethical condition. There's not one board of architects in Europe that has within its code the necessity to not build sometimes because of the conditions of we're not alone on this planet. And this, I think it's a very important condition that can be addressed through projects like the one we saw that poses, so to say, the client as or the inhabitant as the bee, or it can be simply addressed with a old-fashioned professional understanding of the ethical code of architecture. But I would like to bring in another element here, and this has got to do with what we discussed very quickly in the preamble, which was before we went live. And that is the fact that we still have in ecological projects a sort of an understanding that ecology needs to be playing a function. And in particular, there's a very weird translation into ecological thinking of cybernetic thinking. And cybernetic thinking in particular through the entire movements of the idea of, say, self-regulation, which is, of course, the underpinning element of neoliberal economies, the idea of the self determining in a sovereign way its coalitions, associations. What I think the project does is really to highlight how we are dominated by this translation of concepts that migrate from one realm to the other without us being able to think ways of which we can de-economize nature. We can make them less based on households. And I wish that a project on bees would be less the project of houses for bees, and in particular of the projection of a number of human understandings of what architecture ought to be onto another species or multiple species. I think that is one way of maybe moving forward, which then brings an entire question about the functions that are associated with urban-rural distinctions, and I'm thinking in relationship in particular in India with the entire crisis of the rural reforms and the brown clouds that are dominating the entire country, and what that project could be. And so those are just initial thinking, but of course it's an opening for an entire new curriculum, and I think it's an impressive undertaking again.
I'll ask Anushri to take this forward.
Yeah, so I think about the project itself, the fact that people are not actively trying to kill bees, like that was never like the thing I was taking care of, but it was more about the awareness. Like people just don't know about it. And Richard Lowe had this very interesting quote that said, people who care conserve, and people who don't care don't conserve. What is the extinction of a condor to a child who has never seen a wren? So basically it means that someone, how do you conserve something people don't care about? So that's where the question of, does a building which is a research center still have to function purely as a research center? What else could it do? Could it also act like give some amount of awareness towards this cause? Could it add to the whole city as a whole? Like could it add to the green spaces in the city or something like that? Like rather than just looking at a structure for its purely its function, what else? Because you are building, you have to build a research center. But what are you doing with that research center? What are the things as an architect you can add to your structure, which will allow like varying functions without directly interacting with the environment? These were some things which I had to keep in mind when I was trying to, go about this dissertation. Also, another thing which kind of, like in terms of structures being green and like being sustainable and being ecologically aware, I think like we as future architects kind of need to have this awareness or this morality within us constantly. Like we cannot sell a building calling it a green building, because every building we build now must be green. Because I mean, that's the only way we can go forward in the future. We kind of have to have this idea of building for deconstruction, because if we don't build for deconstruction, then we're building for waste, which brings you to Ashubodha's issue of, generating that amount of waste. So it's all kind of linked like that. Like we need to kind of have that amount of responsibility and understand that what we are undertaking while we build these constructions it has its consequences. Like people are getting affected by the things we build. So just having that sensitivity is, I guess, very important, and that's what I try to kind of address with my project as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Anushri. Now I'll just sum up some of the discussion with the last question. So Malini had brought up this question about at what scale do we intervene, and somehow in Anushri's project, what we see is that she has dealt with various scales in her intervention, and this makes us realize that us ask that who can be the decision maker or caretaker for interventions on these existing fabric of the city, and and also on existing infrastructure in the city, and how can such interventions be realized in such a complex system of governance. So I'll leave it over to Malini and then Namrata. Yeah.
I mean, I know you asked me a directed question there, but I wanted one thing which I wanted to foreground. Actually, a few days ago, I chanced upon a talk by Professor Nagarajan from Vijaya Nagarajan, who was looking at columns in South India. And what was very interesting is the talk was titled, How do you feed 1,000 souls? And what was really interesting when Anushri, says that we need to, people don't know what is the impact, and they don't know anything about this correlation between bees and the future. And so unless they know, and therefore this project, I thought it was really revealing to me that this to feed, the rangoli, the practice of drawing these patterns in South India comes from this idea that everybody knows that it's actually at the root of it, it is to feed 1,000 souls. And when the researcher actually finds out that in a very ancient text in the Vedas, there is this line which says that for a Hindu householder, creating a building is an egregious act. It is such an act, it's such a violent act to the environment that you're going to displace so many species that the only way you can atone for it is by feeding 1,000 souls every day. And so this idea of drawing the rangoli with rice flour is actually the act of feeding all the ants and all the other species. So by 10 o'clock, so the lady of the house puts it out at 6 in the morning or at 4 in the morning. And by 10, the rangoli is gone. The column is gone. And it's a daily ritual, which kind of, so in a sense, we've forgotten that. We've forgotten how the act of building, how, what it means to the environment. And I think as practitioners and as architects, this link, which is so embedded actually into our practices, we've lost that. And so, that's, one thing I wanted to kind of help us wonder about the various practices, whether it is about how we build, what we build, I think it's all kind of disconnected from somewhere in the past that we had this connect, which is, maybe we need to inhabit and re-understand and reinvent those connections. That's what I want to say.
What I really liked about this project was also like that there were so many parts that, if you can't do all of this, you can do this. If you can't do this, you can do this, like that kind of a thing. And I just thought that's a great way of actually planning projects, what is the, like, if everybody had to ask, like, what is the least common denominator that I would like to get implemented within my project, and that's an interesting question to ask. I just thought, I'm just going to leave you guys with a couple of questions, and one of them happens to be, this governance question. Like, if you had to implement this project that you are doing, who are the people that you would want to put in the room to present your project to? That is one question. And the second question is, you all don't have to answer it because we are running out of time. And the second question is, who are the people that you're sure will be protesting outside your room? These are the two questions that I want you all to think about. So, like, actually 3 questions. So what's the least common denominator that you want to get implemented? What is the sort of, like, who are the people in the room and who are the people outside protesting? And I think that's where I'd like to stop it.
Thank you. Nikhil, do you want to wrap up? Are there any questions in the Q&A? No? Okay, so we get to go home early. Thank you, everyone. It was a fantastic discussion. It was a wide range of expertise on the panel, and we got to hear varying, at sometimes also contesting responses to the projects, and I hope that it leaves us and the panelists with a more rich direction to take forward. I will wrap it up with a huge thank you to each one of you, John, Malini, Namrata, students, Anushri, Vaishnavi, Ashubodha, and Asmita. Thank you. Thank you, KVDF Forum, for giving us this opportunity to come together. Thank you, Nikhil, Akshar, Heer, and Nikhil.
Thank you.
This has indeed been an immensely fascinating and compelling discussion. I'm grateful to all of our panelists, student participants, and moderators for forcing us all to take a step back and put on our thinking hats. As this is the last day of our forum, I now invite some of the students and student panelists to join us as we culminate the Purna Varki Design Forum 2021.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Nikhil. It's quite humbling to also sit at the end of 6 days to sort of try and culminate this whole journey of not just 6 days, but actually 6 months. It started back in January. So without taking a lot of time, there's this small group of us who've been sort of actively organizing it, as well as the other sort of student panelists from other sessions who'd like to share a few of our thoughts as we wrap up the KVDF for 2021. So to do a quick sort of journey through the forum that started on Monday, it started with a memorial lecture, which was given by Tatiana Schneider, which followed by an immensely sort of fascinating discussion with Professor Gauri Bharat and Professor Nilkan Chaya. So in some sense, the memorial lecture sort of was a circle around the entire field of architecture and the challenges that it's posed with, and what more is sort of expected out of this profession at this point. And Ms. Schneider had successfully put together thoughts and actually provocations around our field today and what its future looks like and what we should be doing as architects in the most proactive and articulate way possible. And one of the key things that struck me then was the fact that she said that architecture is not an innocent profession, which a lot of us sort of think it is, because its intrinsic sort of relationship with the capitalist imperial systems and also its direct impact or indirect impact to the ongoing climate crisis are things that cannot be so easily dismissed and also need to be brought into our pedagogy, our discussions. And hence, she urged to sort of design the practice of architecture and models of architecture rather than just buildings and calling it sort of architecture. And one of the key questions that I, along with a lot of people as sort of young professionals just a month into the field, have that is, after listening all this, how do we even take a step further? Because the next thing you do is you take a job somewhere and you're doing things that you're asked to do. And I mean, you obviously do other things as well, but what is the step that you take ahead? And that in that sense, it was an extremely sort of heart-filling discussion, because by the end of it, there were these ways in which Ms. Schneider, as well as the discussion that further unfolded, gave us very pertinent ways of moving forward.
The first curated session definitely built on the many questions which were posed in the memorial lecture. Interestingly, the dialogue between the different line of thoughts which were commenting on 4 different projects, where, as Himanshu pointed out, the architect was positioned at various distances from the benefit or effects of the project. It opened an avenue to reflect on the notion of a role of a practice as well as a profession. The session was very riveting, particularly because it gave an insight to what shoes can we as architects step into in order to do something about these ever-present concerns we have. There was a sense of urgency in how the students talked, and there was a sense of, okay, let's talk about what to do maybe tomorrow in the discourse that followed. The questions which were raised, I feel, left all of us very inspired. Ilse very interestingly pointed out that architecture should not be limited to be a service to service delivery, but should also build new collaborations and systems which look at people and knowledge as infrastructure. Then Himanshu talked about the architect being a part of, in a lived sense for the people they're designing for. And then Rahul asked us very vaguely that what would we feel as architects if the essential users of our buildings just changed most of what we designed? All these arguments, I think, in a certain way, pushed our buttons to say that not just the agency of an architect, but the design resolution by an architect is itself a meager participant in a very large ecosystem. And then Hendrik's discourse and the need for us to embed ourselves in the system and keep ourselves embedded definitely gave us a starting point to start acting towards our aspirations in a sense which is very immediate. What it leaves us with now is the question of how do we begin to embed, both as fresh graduates and students who have agency, which is very different from someone who's established. There is a certain sense of freedom and naivety. Like how Tatiana pointed out in the memorial lecture, it would be very interesting to tap into what I feel something is we should take back as an urgent stimulus from this session and this forum.
Followed by that, we had the conversation by Professor Jonathan Hill. He addressed history in design in history, as it looks at design and understands it not just in context of present but put in a longer time frame. The command of drawing.
Bhakti, you'll have to move your microphone a bit.
Sorry, is this better?
Yes.
The okay. The command of drawing is discussed, and that has transformed the status of architects that results from individualist artistic creation and not accumulation of knowledge of construction team. One of the interesting points Hill made through his study was among all the three original visual arts, that is painters, sculptors and architects. In 19th century, sculptors and painters discarded the word design once that became associated with collective authorship, mass production and problem solving. Further discussing the agency of architect, a critique is made to the idea of architect purely as problem solver. Well, it could be part of the role. There is a need for architects to be recognized as cultural producer. He criticizes architectural profession as the idea of professionals, where introduced as the idea of somebody who would be dispassionate and distanced from issues, while architects need to engage with the idea of society politically, socially, and culturally. Personally, one of the interesting takeaways for me was where he puts forth the idea of designing in a way that leaves room for designing for whom you are designing or inhabiting. Users can be creative as designers, while we are still struggling with implementation on the idea of flexibility and personalization in architectural design. I wonder how one goes about creating that room for users in pedagogy.
Later that evening, the talk between John Palmesino and Namrata Kapoor. One of the things that struck me was that there was these, in both of their presentations and the discussion that follows, there was this interconnectedness of various stakeholders. In Namrata's case, the slum dwellers, the people who were habiting the housing, etc. And in John's case, the non-human, the ocean, the debris that we sort of leave behind when we build, etc. And that this there was this emphasis, and one could clearly sense how they placed themselves as individuals in this web, and how they web of interdependencies that we have been talking about, and how they sort of work in this way. And I think later on, through the discussion, there was also this idea of how to look at architecture beyond just building, and to look at it as forming relationships and negotiations, and to bring together people, and to solve these different issues and different problems that we have been dealing with in our day-to-day life, as well as, for example, in the climate crisis, etc. So and so in that sense, this sort of left me thinking that, how do we sort of now that we've learned whatever we've learned through in these 5 years, how do we now reassess it and try and implement it, not being burdened by the forces that govern the profession, but to actually take it up and sort of push through these difficulties and put our point forward. Yeah.
Right. So the second curated discussion was following the first one, was had its focus on the process that architects and designers sort of employ to achieve their solutions. And speaking of burden, I think this session particularly emphasize the fact that as architects, there's this need to oscillate between being very critical, but also being very creative in our process. The session also sort of questioned, what, how can you sort of, there are three things in particular that it focused on. One being, how does a process start engaging with its site more closely? And how does the architect begin to engage with their own process more closely? And third, it focused on how does one bring about a flexibility in going about their process. So the session was, our panelists for that day was Professor Chaya, Anna Heringer, and Ranjit Hoskote. And all three sort of, contributed to this. And one thing that Anna sort of really stressed upon is that how how, say, a little more love and care in sort of working with your client and working with the locale in your process can go a long way. And then Mr. Ranjit also sort of focused on how we need to rethink your training, or because usually your training in design informs your approach to your process. So that's one thing that he urged us to rethink. And finally, personally, what I sort of observed was that it was interesting to note that more than discussing the role in very formal terms, it started revealing certain personality traits or behavioral traits that we as professionals sort of have, and it oozes out into our process. So something that I would like for all of us to ponder or reflect upon is, how does your own process, how close is your own process, sort of, is it in unison with what you think and what your principles are? So that's something that I would like for all of us to sort of take away from that session.
Right. So after that, we had the second talk between Ilse Wolf and Rahul Mehrotra, which I think questioned the very ideology, with which architects go about approaching their jobs. And I think Ilse very interestingly pointed out that as opposed to tabula rasa, kind of a blank slate thinking of, there being bare virgin sites and people not having occupied them before the design intervention, how, which is also propagated in most schools, how one really needs to understand the context of the context of a site to be able to respond efficiently to its complex urbanity. And I think this is extremely important because these sites are often part of an ever-changing kinetic city, where the role of people in place is constantly shifting. And for instance, certain examples came about, like how migration and flux essentially in cities changes patterns of inhabitation and urbanity. And still in traditional design schools, we think of, for instance, housing as a linear family expanding and incrementally growing, when for all you know, they might, migrate to another settlement in the years to come. Another intriguing line of thought brought forth by the discussion was really questioning this idea of binaries, like rich, poor, conservationist, futuristic, and instead rethinking them and responding to them also as simultaneities, because a lot of these opposites today, they exist in absolute coexistence in our urban environments. Expanding upon the idea of how one needs to break away from the tabula rasa thinking model, Wolf further elaborated how this means that one also needs to reimagine and kind of rethink ideas and habits of assembly as well as disassembly, of not only the material sense, but also how various modes of being come together and disseminate. And I think at this point, Rahul also interestingly pointed out how today that would mean that, the idea of collaboration essentially translates to interdisciplinarity, where, the real aim of a profession should be to define the problem well, not from the lens of our own bias, but from the broader interdisciplinary context. So, this would also mean that one needs to rethink the idea of clients, for instance. Is the client only, a human entity, or is it also the neighborhood, the street, or the planet at large? And this, all these ideas will eventually lend giving architects more agency and instrumentality when, the sphere of our fears regarding various concerns expand to the sphere of our influences. And when both of these, start accelerating together, will our agency truly increase. So, yeah.
Today's session leaves us with these varied projects that just make us aware of the different disturbances with projects that deal with infrastructure. It surely makes us aware that probably an architect alone cannot be the lone problem solver and is a part of the larger ecosystem of construction. The session also intrigued us to think beyond the human needs and highlights the need to just start to think functionally differently, considering everyone we share this world with. And hence the session concluded the idea of interdependency for this year's forum pretty well. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thanks a lot, guys. I would love if any of the student panelists would just like to jump in, pitch in about what they felt through the forum, their journey through it. This being one of the largest and the only student organized forums in South Asia for South Asian contextual discussions and beyond that as well. It will be very interesting to know your thoughts as well as we culminate the forum. Could be anything.
I would just like to add how nicely it was organized, considering it's online and it's really difficult to sort of get together and bring that ease in while having conversation. So kudos to your effort and to the organization team, and good work.
Yeah, we really appreciate the way you all have organized this. I think it's kind of hard to build a connection with your fellow panelists, but you all really like pushed and like we managed to kind of pull it off. So great job, all of all. It was very interesting. All the talks. I love the way the moderators kind of directed it towards the topics, like very gently. You all kind of pushed it and kept it on the rails. So I think that's again like expert navigation right there. So yeah, thanks for having us.
Yes, at this point, there's also another sort of note that I'd like to make is that through the course of this forum, considering various other sort of aspects that we are going through worldwide, there was this attempt to bring about this gender neutrality while having these discussions, and how we've always attempted for that to happen through this course of this week. But if at any point in time, mistakenly also, if that has not been the case, we would like to apologize for that as well, because that was one of our key attempts through the course of this forum as well. Does anyone else have anything to add?
The last thing I want to add is that we'll be attempting, so since this is the 20th time KVDF is getting organized, we are planning on publishing a booklet, a publication which we'll be sending off to all the panelists. And the publication will take some time, I think another 2-3 months at least. And all of you are welcome to write for it, to give your opinions and approach us. The links are there on the KVDF website. And also we organized a writing competition, the results for which were supposed to be out today, but due to some technical discrepancies on our end, we will soon be releasing them by next week. I really want to apologize for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhavya. Thank you all for joining us. On behalf of the KVDF 21 team, I would like to thank everybody, all the participants to for joining us this time. And also, I would like to thank all the organizers and all the team members who have worked so hard to put up the forum this year. Thank you, and well, see you, I guess, soon.
Yes, thanks guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.